Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Durenda Wilson. Durenda is a homeschooling mom of 8, born from 1991 to 2004, 7 of whom have graduated. She's been married to Daryl for 34 years, and they have 12 grandkids. Durenda has written The Unhurried Homeschooler, The 4-Hour Homeschool Day, and Raising Boys to Men. She's the host of the Durenda Wilson podcast and enjoys speaking at events where she can encourage homeschooling parents to experience freedom on their homeschooling journey. And before I started, I mentioned to you, so many people have said, you've got to get Durenda on your podcast. So I'm really delighted to have the chance to chat with you today. There's like the official biography there at the beginning, but you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and how you got started homeschooling.
Well, we've been homeschooling for over 30 years. Like you said, we've graduated 7. Our youngest is 19. He's on the spectrum, so he's taking a little bit longer than the rest of the crew, but we're confident he'll get there. And that's the great thing about homeschooling, is that we get to just do it at the pace that works for our kids. He's not intimidated by it. He doesn't feel bad about it. So it's nice. He knows he's not quite ready yet, and that it's okay. So yeah, we've been homeschooling for over 30 years, and I actually went into our marriage knowing that I wanted to homeschool. Unfortunately, my husband had a brother who was homeschooling at the time. So it wasn't an odd or strange idea to him. This was back in 1989. So that was really a blessing. But yeah, we just knew from day one, that's what we wanted to do. And there were many reasons for that, but we're so glad that we took this journey and saw it through all the way to the end.
Yeah, and I love the perspective that homeschooling over those decades has given you, because a lot has changed in the homeschool landscape in those years. When you first began, when your children were first being born, that's when I was initially being homeschooled, my brother and I, in the 80s and 90s. And now I'm homeschooling my own children. And I have personally seen so much change. And so I'm curious if there are ways in which your perspective on home education, your philosophy of homeschooling has grown and changed over the years.
Yeah, it's interesting because we started out with this unhurried approach to homeschooling, which I'm still a firm believer in. And mainly, if nobody knows what I'm talking about, I'm talking about just not rushing into schoolwork immediately at 5 years old because they're 5 years old. That's not a good reason to sit down and start forcing lessons on them unless they're ready. And a lot of kids are, but there are a lot that are not. And so just being sensitive to and knowing your child. That's how we started. I thought I'm just going to take an unhurried approach, and we'll just, as they're ready, we'll incrementally add more. And that worked really well for all of our kids. And I thought that initially that it would just be sort of like something we just did in the early years, the unhurried idea. But what I found was over time, I realized that learning can't be rushed. It can't be forced. And so if you're going to have real learning happening, there has to be a certain amount of time that's given to that, some time and space for your kids to learn some things on their own, because they're actually quite amazing self-teachers when you give them the right environment. And so that's something that was surprising to me, how much my kids taught themselves if I gave them enough time and space. The other thing is that I always believed that kids were natural learners and my job was not to burn them out. And I found out that wasn't just initially. Again, that was ongoing. And so the challenge for me and the lesson for me was that simplicity was often best when it came to the actual curriculum and bookwork, at least for my family. Everybody has to make that decision. And I think things can get more involved as the kids are interested, but to start out with a simpler plan and a simpler approach actually, and some margin, actually gives space for your kids to jump in, attach themselves to ideas, and move forward with those. The challenge is not becoming overscheduled. And so that was something that I had to, fight a lot over the years. But so my philosophy didn't actually change. It just sort of like continued into longer. It deepened, and it went further and longer than I had originally thought. And of course, there gets to be a point at which there is a bigger load for the kids in terms of the book work, especially as they get into high school and all that. But it still for us was very reasonable because I believed that they needed some margin in the afternoon every day, even if they were in high school. Why burn them out? Why kill their love for learning at that point in the game when they have loved it all these years and now we're going to kill it in high school? Not going to do that. So yeah, I made sure that they had that margin every day. So it was interesting to see how that just sort of continued.
I think that's going to be a real encouragement for moms to hear because there's a lot of emphasis. You see the beautiful reels on Instagram of these early years of homeschooling and the slow, education. And then all of a sudden we're like, all right, middle school and high school. And now we got to buckle down and change everything, ignore everything we loved about homeschooling.
Yes.
And that is helpful, I think, to hear that there are still ways you can have this unhurried approach, that margin, that opportunity to still pursue interests. In my homeschool, when I talk about homeschool planning, I'd like to talk about the time budget. We talk about a money budget and you would never, allocate every single dollar. You keep some of that money for an emergency fund for when the air conditioning broke, like ours did a few weeks ago, or, when the car breaks down. And sometimes with our homeschool schedule, we don't give any white space. We just fill up our whole time and then something goes wrong or, the toddler has a blowout or, someone's having a hard day. And all of a sudden you don't have any white space. Where's your emergency fund of time? So it's good to leave that white space in the day.
And the problem with that is what we end up doing is my husband calls it opportunity cost. If you spend it here, you can't spend it here. So if you spend that time, that energy over here, you won't have the time and the energy to spend on the things that come up unexpectedly, like discipline issues. If we plan for discipline issues, so plan our days that there's a block of time when we're going through whatever part of the day we're going through, add a little extra time for some things that might come up that need to be addressed. And then we can address them in a much more thoughtful, intentional way because we haven't spent all that time over here. And, it's a stewardship thing, I think is really what it comes down to is basically what you're saying. We steward our finances. Why don't we steward our time and our energy throughout the day? We only have so much in a day. And we need to definitely be wise with it and be investing the way that God calls us to invest.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Durenda, over the years of homeschooling, what have been some of your favorite parts of homeschooling?
I'd have to say that it's definitely the opportunity to build strong relationships and make connections between all of us, but specifically between the kids, to have those strong sibling connections. That has just been such a blessing. And that's about time being spent together. So I would say that that's my other favorite part of homeschooling is the amount of time that we got to spend together. Now, did I ever get tired of all of us being together? Absolutely. Did I ever need a break? Absolutely. But I would say that overall, the memories were made, the connections were made because of the amount of time that we spent together. That might also mean that we're overcoming difficulties together, whether that's difficulties in our relationships, difficulties in our homeschooling, difficulties in, maybe we're doing a project together or whatever, or just life difficulties where we are overcoming together. We're a team. And I think that was the other thing is that we functioned as a team. And I think there was something really valuable in that. But in order for that to happen, I felt like that we needed to be together more than we were apart. And it just requires time,
Yeah.
So that I would say that was the other thing that I would also like to bring up is that in times of crisis, which our family has been in several times over the years, it was such a sweet opportunity to bring our kids back to the Lord over and over and over again and to model to them, who do we turn to when we're in a crisis? What do we prioritize when we're in a crisis? Well, I can tell you it's not math curriculum. It's going to be me pulling my kids onto my lap and us crying together because we lost our first grandson, or trying to help our kids process the fact that their baby brother didn't come home from the hospital because he had to be there for 2 months with an open heart surgery, and trying to help them understand that God was still in control and that he was good and he was taking care of Silas, and just so many opportunities to really just share the Lord with our kids. And if I had tried to send them to school in the middle of all that, none of it would have been processed well. My biggest prayer when we were in crisis was, God, please help my kids not to misinterpret who you are because of what's happened. And he answered that prayer. But, being together was part of the answer to that prayer.
I have definitely seen that in our own family's life over the past year with my youngest son, his leukemia diagnosis and the treatment that he's been going through and continues to go through. One, I'm so thankful for the sibling bonds, for the bonds between children and parents that we already had nourished. Not that you can't have those bonds if you don't homeschool, but I think it has made it so much simpler. And we had a rich family culture and family, like you were saying, that team perspective. I'm thankful we already had that as a good foundation. And then to be able to go through a year going on to 2 years now where things in our homeschool are just not the way they normally would be or the way we anticipated them to be, but to be able to prioritize the relationship time, to be able to flex. Like sometimes you just got to still do the math and sometimes you still got to do the chore, even though we're all really tired and kind of crying. But sometimes we can say, you know what, let's just sit and read together, or let's sit and watch a movie together, or let's go for a walk together. And those can be really valuable too, to be able to constantly be pointing them to the Lord in the midst of what's very hard.
To have the flexibility to do that. I like what you said about sometimes we do have to go ahead and do the thing we need to do. And honestly, sometimes that routine, that taking out the garbage, that, doing the dishes, fixing a meal actually anchors us because it's something normal in the midst of so many things that don't feel normal. And so that's where our simple sort of skeleton routine can really be beneficial. I think every family should have one, just a skeleton. These are the basics that need to happen on our skeleton days where we're just running on empty. And that way it doesn't cause more problems, because if the children aren't fed on time, or if, the naps don't happen, the rest time doesn't happen for the little ones, everything just gets worse, not better. And it's even harder for everybody to process. So yeah, I think that is the beauty of homeschooling, is just having the flexibility to be able to make that call each day throughout the day.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you've talked about homeschooling in times of crisis, and that can be its own set of challenges. But sometimes just homeschooling on an ordinary Tuesday has its own sets of challenges. So, what have been some of the challenges of homeschooling, and how did you seek to overcome those?
I think probably being intentional and doing what I know that God had called us to. Don't add to it and don't take away from it, but just simply, what's the last thing he told you, and just keep doing that thing. And so not allowing other voices to drown out what he's already told us to do. And so that, I could give an example. There was a day that actually things were going great, and they'd been going great. And it was noteworthy in my mind. So I'm thinking, wow, I think we've actually found a rhythm. We've been in it. It's been working, and I was just sort of rejoicing in that. And then all of a sudden I had this thought: what if there were cameras in my house and people were watching what we're actually doing? What would they say? And then this barrage of just condemnation, and you're a terrible homeschooling mom. You're not doing enough. Your children are going to be losers. You're not doing them anything. I mean, all these thoughts went through my head. So I just said, Lord, tell me, I don't know how I went from here to here so fast, but can you help me reconcile this? And he brought me back to the story of the loaves and the fishes, when Jesus told the disciples, feed the 5,000, right? He's telling them to do something that's impossible. And there are days when we're homeschooling that what we're doing feels impossible. And of course, the disciples made it clear. They're like, they're trying to figure out, how can we do this? Yeah, we can't even work enough to make enough. They're trying to work it out in their heads, right? And so, but Jesus just says to them, basically, they came to the conclusion it was impossible. And he said to them, bring me what you have. So he didn't ask for what they didn't have. He asked for what they did have. And so that was my reminder: Durenda, you're responsible to bring me everything you have. You're all in, like 100%. But you have to know that basically, I know that it's never enough, quote unquote, right? We never know if it's enough. So it was like he was saying, bring me what you have and I will multiply it and make it more than enough. And that is exactly what he did. And so that would be my encouragement. Be all in, be there, show up, be fully present, but know that, there are days when we're not even fully present. Maybe there's a crisis going on that kids don't know about, but we're processing. God knows that, so bring your best, bring what you have, and it is acceptable to him, and he is pleased with it, and he will multiply it and make it enough. And I think the other temptation, I think this is every mom's temptation, and that is not to overload our schedule with too many activities, because often when we start to become afraid, fearful that we're not doing enough, or we see somebody over there doing 3 different things and we're not doing any of those things, and it's the comparison, the distraction, those are our 2 biggest enemies. And so we try to compensate in our own flesh by overloading our schedule with activities, thinking it'll help us feel more at peace, when it just brings chaos to our own hearts, to our family rhythms. So we want to remain intentional with our family rhythms, and our family rhythms are going to look different than other people's family rhythms. And there's no point in sitting there comparing and contrasting, not that we can't learn from other people, but let the Lord just bring it to you. Don't be looking for it. I say, ask the Lord if you think there's a gap, something that needs to be changed or tweaked, and ask him to bring you the idea, or whatever it is that you need. Don't go hunting for it too heavily, because then it turns into like our own effort, instead of just having it come to us and realizing, oh my gosh, I asked the Lord to bring this to me, and he did, that we know it's him. It's not just us conjuring something up. And so I would say those were probably my biggest challenges.
How many times has a homeschool mom been feeling like insufficient, like I'm worried we're not doing enough? And so they just like go to the internet and they download a bunch of free printables and they say, okay, what are all those people doing? I'm going to do all of those things, right? And it's not anything new. I'm second generation homeschooler. I've seen that desire. It starts as an earnest, godly desire, I think, to do an excellent job. We are called to do the very best job we can as homeschool moms. And that's a good desire. But then it can sometimes turn into a bit of idolatry, where we put all of this pressure on ourselves to be the Holy Spirit and maybe take on some responsibilities that aren't ours. Yeah. And I do think, although that has always been there, the pressure that homeschool moms have put on themselves, this fear, this anxiety, am I doing enough? I do think that in some ways it's gotten a bit worse because we're able to see behind the scenes, at least a stylized picture or video of all of these different homeschoolers doing all of these different amazing things. And it can be really hard to be comparing what you're doing to all these things you're seeing on the internet, right? Or even hearing about on a podcast. So what are some ways that homeschool moms can reject the idolatry of perfectionism, while also still holding to that standard of excellence, right? Not just throwing up our hands and be like, it doesn't matter, I can do whatever. So how can we truly what does that look like to really trust God with our homeschools?
Well, I think it starts by seeking him first. What does he have for you and your family? And really hearing from him, getting your direction from him. I think about the scripture that says, commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, and the justice of your cause like the noonday sun. So God is faithful. And if we commit our way to him and we fear him and we acknowledge him in all of our ways, he will direct our path. And so when that's clear, make sure that that is, clear to you. And then you stay on that course unless he clearly directs you some other way. I think there's an element, again, of stewardship of our social media. Know yourself, know what your red flags are, know what's too much for you. Don't ride it all the way to the end and a little bit over. keep your boundaries where they need to be in order for you to stay intentional to do what God has called you to do. Nothing more and nothing less. We don't want to add to it. We don't want to take away from it. We want to do what he has called us to do. And this also means that we have to lay aside our own agenda, um, maybe our own ideas about how things are supposed to look. Not that we can't have some. I don't think that that's true. I think that God does put some things on our heart for our family, but how that's going to be walked out, you need to look to him for guidance in each season, because every year the kids are different. We're different. Our circumstances are different. And so we have to constantly be tweaking and adjusting and being willing to pivot. So we lay our agenda down. We actually lay it down at the Lord's feet, and we ask him to give us back what he wants for us and make it really, really clear. And then also recognize that God is always working in our kids. He is always at work in the hearts and lives of our children. And we need to ask him for the eyes to see how he's working. So what is he already doing? So we're not doing the shaping and the molding. God is doing the shaping and the molding, and we're cooperating with whatever he's doing in the moment. So if that means encouragement to press through a math lesson, then we do that. If it's we need to delay the math lesson down because there's a character issue that needs to be dealt with, and that definitely is taking priority over this, you know that because you can see it, you know it, and you do it, and you say, I'm going to lay down our agenda to get this math lesson done to take care of this because this is actually more important. And so I think it's just a yielding. It is a yielding to him, and then whatever he has told you to do it well. Do it to the best of your ability, and also recognize that he is God and we are not. So we're not perfect. We're never going to do everything perfectly. But God can take what we have to offer and he can multiply it and make it enough. And of course, we give our all, we give our best, we show up every day. We're fully present in all of that. But again, we're trusting God to fill the gaps, because there are always going to be gaps in our kids' education. There will be. But he is super faithful at taking care of those.
Yeah, that is such a comfort as a homeschool mom.
Yeah, for sure.
Or just a mom in
For
general,
sure.
a human
Yes.
being.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's not just the homeschool moms or parents who are experiencing pressure. In some ways, it feels like just childhood is under attack these days in many ways. Do you have some suggestions for how we can nurture and encourage a peaceful and joyful childhood?
Yeah, I would say resist overscheduling, resist feeling like you have to participate in everything, and just ask the Lord to help you get over the FOMO. I know it's a real thing. It's a fear of missing out. I experience it too. But we really, at the end of the day, what we really want is what's best for our kids and what's best for our family. And so if we're missing out on something that isn't the best for our family, we're actually not missing out on anything. So if we can just remember that, I think be a diligent gatekeeper when it comes to protecting your children online, when it comes to protecting them when we're out. I mean, we would never let them run into the street and play, right? We would never do that. So we want to think the same way about their hearts, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. We want to disciple them in a way that keeps things simple and God focused. I think that's really, really important. We keep pointing them back to the Lord. The best example that I can give when it comes to protecting our kids is the greenhouse idea of when you start a seed in a little pot of soil, you put it in a greenhouse because it's a very controlled environment, because that seed is very fragile and it's not going to be able to become a strong plant if it doesn't get a strong start. So we have it in the greenhouse. We make sure the temperature is just right. It's getting watered, not too much, but not too little. We're constantly nurturing that little seed, and we see it come out of the ground, and it's still really fragile. It needs to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And when it's finally to a point where it's somewhat sturdy and strong, then we can put it out in the elements briefly for short periods of time. And then eventually it's longer periods of time. And then eventually it just gets planted in the garden for good. And so it's the same thing with our children. We're nurturing, we're completely protecting in those early years. And again, there's going to be things that come along that, in spite of all of our protection, they're still going to be exposed to. And then we have to recognize that God has allowed that to happen, and that we have an opportunity now to talk to them about this thing in a developmentally appropriate way for them, in a very simple way. Kids generally do not need all the information we adults need. They don't need all that information. They need very little to be satisfied and have their questions answered. An example that I would give is when we would go through the grocery store line, I tried to keep an eyeball on everybody to see. Well, first of all, when I got into the grocery line, I looked at all the magazines, and if there was something inappropriate, I flipped them over. So while we're going through the line, my kids aren't going to see this, right? So that's my first thing. But I kept watching. Sometimes I would forget, and I would already be like in front of the cashier, and I couldn't get past the cart to fix that. And I was like, okay, I'd just watch, and I'd see if anything caught anybody's eye. And just to be sure, when I got in the car, I would say, hey, we were standing in line. There were lots of magazines there. Did you guys see anything that you have questions about? Or, what did you notice? Or made it super chill, no, not pressurized or anything. And usually I would find out they didn't notice. They didn't see it. And it was just like, thank you, Lord, for that grace. Don't have to talk about this today. But then other times they would say something, and they knew they could talk to me about it. And I would usually just give them a really simple answer that pointed them back to the Lord. And that was it. And we were done. So that's just a simple example of ways that we protect our kids as we're out and about, and now, unfortunately, there's going to be that cross-dresser that you happen to see in the store. Sometimes the kids notice and sometimes they don't. Again, so you have to be aware of what they're noticing. What are they seeing? What are they taking in? And we had this happen actually at a coffee shop. We went to a farmer's market, and we got routed the wrong way to the coffee shop, ended up going through the Pride Parade area. And I said, oh, it's Pride Parade. And my granddaughter said, she's 8. She said, what's Pride Parade? I said, her mom was with her. I said, I'll let your mom explain that to you. And we got to the coffee shop, and everything was fine. And then all of a sudden the parade was over, and they were coming over to the coffee shop. And it was so funny because our whole a bunch of our family was there. So my daughter-in-law, a couple of my daughter-in-laws, my son. And anyway, we're all sitting there, and one of my daughters-in-law looks at me and she goes, I think it's time to go. And I was like, and she's like doing this. And I said, what? And she points me over, and I was like, so there's this huge protection for Ella, from not just me and her mom, but the whole family were like, it's time to leave now. So we leave, and, we can explain that to our kids and just basically say, there are just some people who they don't know Jesus and they don't understand. They think they want to be something that God didn't make them. And so, this man thought that he wants to be a woman, but he doesn't understand that he's fearfully and wonderfully made just the way he is. And God has a plan and a purpose for him. So you see how most of it's being pointed back to the Lord and his goodness and his faithfulness and the fact that he's our creator. So we can take those opportunities and really bring our kids back to the Lord even more often, because we're seeing it more often. So I know it's sad in many ways that our children have to be exposed to that. But the flip side is we get this opportunity to equip them in a really unique way in our culture.
Yeah. And as we are able to be right there beside them and noticing many of the things they're noticing, having open conversations, being able to not just, hide from the things around us, but to be able to approach it and discuss it in a way that honors the Lord and is based on the word of God. That's a real gift as Christian families, walking as wise people in our current age.
It's like taking what Satan means for evil and using it for good. We take this thing that Satan means for evil, and instead we're glorifying God in it. What a total slam on the enemy and his efforts. I just think, what what a beautiful opportunity to just continue to advance the kingdom of God, you know? I love it.
Yeah, fighting lies with the truth, right?
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things I love to ask veteran homeschool moms on the podcast or just when I meet them in real life is what advice would you give yourself if you could go back to your young homeschool mom self and give yourself a piece of advice? What do you think you would say to yourself as a young homeschooling mama?
I would say God is faithful and that your kids are going to be fine. Like, the worrying that we do along the way. I mean, I do feel like I had a good amount of peace along the way. And I'm so thankful for that because I know that's not always the case. That was a gift from the Lord. It also came from leaning really hard into Him and being humble and recognizing that I couldn't do it on my own. I could not do it on my own. I needed Him desperately. And so that clinging to Him um, was definitely I would tell myself, keep doing that, do that even more. I think another thing that if I had to go back and do it over again, I think I would have had maybe more focus on um, church history and doctrine because I have found that I would never had studied that before. Hadn't studied. Some of it happened when the kids were older and they got into like high school curriculum and stuff that had the mystery of history, those kinds of things. Super fascinating, but I'd never been taught that. I didn't know that much about it, but I think that if I could go back and do it over again, I would just like study right alongside of my kids and just really dive into church history. And because there's just it's such an amazing story of perseverance and such a testimony that the church will prevail no matter what. We often sorry, it's my dog. Hopefully you can't hear that. We often get discouraged in our culture because we see a good amount of darkness and wickedness happening right now. But when we look back and we see there were so many other times in history when the church was in those same situations. And not only did she survive, but she thrived. And so, like, the church could actually thrive in the midst. That's what I see the potential for, knowing what church history has shown. And so being able to look back and look at that and have hope for now and for the future, I think that's something I would have done a little differently.
I love hearing that. Church history is actually a really big part of our family, just culture and life.
Awesome.
Something we talk to our
Can I
kids
come
about.
over and
Something I
learn from
love.
you?
Yes, yes. Well, I have to give you a recommendation. The
Awesome.
Kids Talk Church History podcast is
Okay.
produced by the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and two of my daughters are some of the co-hosts on that.
Oh, nice.
Simonetta Carr has written many wonderful church history biographies for children, as well as a full-length book. But it's a great podcast. I know it says like kids talk church history, but it's really for the whole family.
I
So
love
really
that.
wonderful. They are working their way chronologically. So they began with the early church and they're now I think in the Reformation time period, but
Sounds
really
perfect.
great resource. And one of
Well,
the
I have
things I
grandkids that are
yes.
homeschooling, so
Yes, you should tell them. They can even submit questions. The hosts will answer the questions. But one
love
of the
that.
things I've always told my kids is this is your family story because we are connected in such an
Mhm.
amazing spiritual way, covenantally,
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
all of these saints, from Old Testament times
Yes.
to the early church to today. And so there's something really incredible. I'm like getting goosebumps talking about it,
I
but like
love
something
that.
really incredible thinking about this connection we have with them.
Mhm.
So just like it would be fun to hear a story about your grandpa, your great grandpa, like learn the stories of your great grandparents in the faith because you see God's faithfulness. You see that they are Jesus's church, like just like we
Mhm.
are today,
Mhm.
and it gives us much needed perspective, I think,
Yeah.
on
Yes.
current times. But it's also just encouraging to see
Absolutely.
how Christ will
Absolutely.
not let His church fail, which is
I
very
I
encouraging.
love I love that. And then when you're in church on Sunday, you're not just thinking about the people you're worshiping with. You actually are. I feel like we're singing in one accord with all the ancestors in our church history as well. Like we're all singing. They're singing from in heaven, and we're
Yeah.
singing from here, and it's just an amazing. It's so anchoring and grounding. Which is what we need. The world is changing constantly, constantly, constantly. And there's always something new, something different, and it's exhausting. So to have something so stable and so sure, I think is just amazing. I'm so sorry about that dog.
I can't even hear it. So,
Okay, good.
well, it's okay. A little bit of
Okay.
funky noise. Sometimes, one of my Echo Dots will like beep at me and it's like, it's
Right.
fine. We're used to
Okay.
random noises.
Okay, good.
Oh, Durenda, this has been an absolute delight to chat with you today. Thank you for sharing your perspective and your wisdom. Here at the end, though, before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you the two questions that I'm asking all of my guests this season. So the first question is, what are you personally reading lately?
Okay, right now I am reading Take Back Your Family by Jeff Bethke. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it is really about family being on a mission, as opposed to raising individuals who are going to go out and go on individual missions. It's family on a mission, determining, you kind of have to watch it unfold, but it's just about, getting to know your family and getting to know what is the heart of your family. What are the things you don't like? Like, for instance, if you don't like it when people are lonely, maybe part of your family mission is to reach out to the lonely, to have people over, to host people, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the idea behind it. So he just kind of dives in how that ties back to how Hebrew families were so connected, and they didn't live separately. They all lived together in extended growing homes with grandparents and aunts and uncles. And so the benefits of just having a big extended family, and that could be your biological family. Maybe that's not possible. It could be a church family. It could be other believers. But anyway, it's super, super encouraging. Really, really appreciate it. It was a very different perspective on family, other than our cultural nuclear family kind of perspective. It was more of a biblical perspective.
That sounds like a fascinating one. I like that idea. Like,
Really
or sometimes we'll be like, Team Sloan, All right, it's us, it's us against the world.
Exactly.
Well, the final question I have for you is, what would be your best tip for helping get through a homeschool day or maybe a homeschool season where it seems like everything is going completely wrong?
Right. Well, I think the first question is, when things are going south on a day, we need to ask ourselves, is this the exception or the rule? And because sometimes a bad day can feel like it's been a bad week, but it really hasn't. It's only been a bad day, or maybe a bad 2 days, in a row. And then all of a sudden we're doubting ourselves, and we're doubting our homeschooling and our everything. We're doubting everything. So I think the big thing is to take a step back and to hit the pause button, whether that means you're just taking a morning, an afternoon, a day, a week, whatever it takes to get clarity from the Lord as to what's going on, because something's happening, and sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's just a little maintenance that needs to happen. We've been in the house a lot, and I feel like everybody just needs to get outside for a while. So we're just going to lay down the schoolwork, or maybe tomorrow we're going to plan to go do something fun. We're going to go hiking or something instead. And so being able to take that step back, hit the pause button, evaluate what's going on with the Lord's help and wisdom, and then move forward from there. Obviously, we're praying through this. But then also remembering that this is that sort of messy in the middle part of life, of raising kids, of homeschooling. It's like looking at the back of a tapestry. If you've ever looked at it, it's not beautiful. It's very messy. And you're thinking, how could this ever be anything beautiful? And then you turn it over, and it's gorgeous and it's intricate. And I feel like that's what God's doing in our families, is he's creating this tapestry. And we only get to see mostly the threads on the back most of the time, because we're part of what's happening back there. He's, working on it. But eventually, and sometimes every now and then, God gives us a quick view to encourage us and keep us going. But at the end of the day, when we're done and we're moving forward, and our kids have launched, and we'll get to see a lot more of what God was doing and how beautiful it really is. But in the meantime, it's a faith walk. We have to trust the Lord. I don't know how people do this without the Lord. I couldn't do it without the Lord. I would have probably had to be locked up in an insane asylum or something. But he is He is our hope. He's our rock. He's the one we cling to, and he's the one who makes it all so good.
That is such a great encouragement to finish up this conversation. Dorinda, where can people find you all around the internet?
Okay, well, you can find my 4 books at Amazon. You can find the audiobooks for the boy book and the Unhurried Homeschooler at my website, durendawilson.com. And I also have a podcast. It is called the Durenda Wilson Podcast. Creative, I know, but but my name is different enough that it works. So that podcast can be found on any platform or at my website. The cool thing, though, is there's over 540 episodes. So if you go to the podcast page of my website, this is the only place I have it. There's a search bar, and you can put in keywords, and the episodes will come up that are on that topic that you really need to hear about. So you don't have to scroll through 540 episodes.
I love that. That is perfect. And I will have all of those links in the show notes for this episode over at humilityanddoxology.com. Thank you to everyone who has either listened or watched today. Make sure you take a minute to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And until next time, happy homeschooling.